The Universal One by Walter Russell, Book 2, Chapter 12, Gravitation and Radiation. Gravitation is the generative force, and radiation is the degenerative force of the universal constant. These are the opposing powers which, within all mass, seek an equilibrium zone of pressure for the potential of that mass. Gravitation is the generative force of increasing potential and the regenerative force of decreasing potential. It is the power within the electric force of action to attract the electric force of action. It is the contractive power within electricity to divert the universal constant of energy into centripetal vortices of closing spirals of increasing speed, thereby attracting similar states of motion into an accumulation of mass, the pressure of which increases toward its center. It is an expression of the power of electricity to accumulate by induction, and by so doing, to force magnetism to increase its resistance to that accumulation. It is the inductive force. It is the desire within the electric force of action to integrate into the appearance of form. It is the power of electricity to associate by displacement. Radiation is the power of magnetism to dissociate by replacement. Radiation is the degenerative force of decreasing potential. It is the power within the magnetic force of reaction to resist the electric force of action. It is the separative force which repels, spreads, separates, diffuses, and redistributes that which has been assembled by the collective force. It is the conductive force. The attraction of gravitation and the repulsion of radiation is nature's simple method of distribution and redistribution of all masses, so that each mass will find its proper position. It is not proper to conceive either of these apparently opposite forces as two forces. The south wind and the north wind are not two winds. They are the same wind blowing in opposite directions. It is more correct to say that gravitation and radiation are processes. The one motive force which directs these processes is equally divided into opposite effects, but these opposite effects are unequally balanced. The unequal divisions of the two opposites totaled together constitute an equilibrium. The one force never subdivides into any minus expression of force without counterbalancing that minus with an equal and opposite plus. Gravitation is a synthetic process of putting things together, and radiation an analytic one of taking them apart. The chemist uses these processes in every action and reaction. Consider, for example, the reduction of iron oxide at high temperature by passing a jet of hydrogen over it. What happens? The hydrogen falls toward the higher potential of the oxygen of the iron, which is sufficiently expanded by the high temperature to absorb the hydrogen, and the hot iron is sufficiently expanded to release the oxygen. This is an effect of gravitation in respect to the oxygen and the hydrogen. They unite, they mutually integrate, and freeze into amorphous crystals of such extended orbits that they assume the liquid state known as water. On the contrary, it is an effect of radiation in respect to the iron and the oxygen. Both the iron and the oxygen have been brought to such a state of expansion that their ability to hold together is gradually weakened until their pressure preponderance is reversed. Attraction has changed to repulsion. The iron expels the oxygen, which falls toward the proper pressure zone for so expanded a state of motion. The oxidation process is an effect of the electric pressure of gravitation. The reduction process is an effect of the magnetic pressure of radiation. They exactly balance. The reduction in valence, pressure, temperature, and other dimensions of the iron is balanced by an exact increase of the dimensions of the hydrogen oxide. The plus of gravitation in any mass is always balanced by the minus of radiation in some other mass, in accordance with the pressure laws. Every pressure develops an equal and opposite pressure, and the degeneration of any mass is exactly balanced by the regeneration of another mass. All mass is constantly in motion. This is a universe of perpetual motion. The universal constant of energy is expressed by mass in motion. Every mass is continually changing its dimensions in accordance with its relation to every other mass. Change in the position of mass causes change in every dimension of that mass. All mass is potential out of place, and all mass constantly seeks the proper pressure zone for its changing potential. All mass constantly runs the entire gamut of every dimension of the wave of energy of which it is a swirling part, until it has run the entire cycle represented by that wave. No mass can remain fixed in position, not even that which has been apparently arrested in its motion. The apple, obeying the laws of gravitation, falls to the ground to seek the pressures for its relatively high potential, where it is apparently arrested in its motion. In reality, it never ceases to fall until it has reached the center of the planet. It merely changes its dimensions. The disintegrating apple rises in the air to seek the proper pressures for the relatively low potential left behind by the electric stream, which continued to the gravitative center of the planet. Like all mass, the apple is simultaneously accumulating and distributing its accumulation of energy. It is both charging and discharging. The interruption of the apple's fall to the Earth's center and the subsequent reversal of the charge within the mass of the disintegrating apple do not alter the opposite directions of motion, either for the charge or for the discharge. The accumulated electric potential continues spirally north by way of east in the electric stream to the planet's center, and the disintegration emanations continue south by way of west in the magnetic stream of the Earth's ecliptic. The bound energy being released by the disintegrating apple exchanges its power-time preponderance for speed-time preponderance. The balancing opposite of greater power-time is within the planet. Consider familiar effects of gravitation and apply that observation to others less readily understood. The apple falls to the ground. The gas rises into the air. The planet moves in space. The apple and the gas are potentials out of place. When released, one falls, the other rises. One gravitates, and the other radiates toward the pressure zones of their respective accumulations of potential, and they pass each other going in opposite directions. A planet is potential in place for the moment. If suddenly it were released from out beyond Neptune's orbit, what would happen? Assuming that it held itself together and did not explode in so low a pressure zone, it would fall with increasing swiftness toward the sun in a line ever slightly curving northeasterly until it reached the orbit from which it had been removed. Arriving at the plane of its former orbit, it would sink below it toward the sun with decelerating speed, then after oscillating above and below for a time to lose its impetus, and to find the inertial equilibrium position of its potential, it would eventually proceed in approximately the same orbit as before. It would have been somewhat damaged by expansion and surface ionization. Its potential would be slightly lowered as a consequence of its adventure in lower pressure zones, and therefore its orbit would be slightly farther from the sun than before its removal. Once more, imagine the giant hand picking up the planet and removing it in the opposite direction, toward the sun instead of away from it. If suddenly released within Mercury's orbit, for example, what would happen? For the purpose of analogy, let us forget the fact that its low density in comparison to that of Mercury would cause its surface to become white-hot and its oceans to disappear in a tenuous vapor. It would fall away from the sun curving southeasterly toward its orbital plane of pressure at an ever-decreasing speed, exactly as an atom of gas would rise from the Earth and fall at an ever-decreasing speed in an ever-curving southeasterly line toward its proper plane of pressure. The dimensions of this planet would not permit it to remain in Mercury's pressure zone any more than the density of a wooden ball would allow the ball to remain underwater in the pressure suitable to a stone. It would approximately find its former orbit, but because of the increased potential absorbed during its adventure in higher pressure zones, its orbit would be slightly nearer to the Sun than before its removal. This universe of motion is one of equilibrium from the beginning of motion to maximum motion, during which progression stability exchanges its reality for an illusion of stability. There is a true position for every potential. The true position must be found for the exact dimensions of the universal constant of energy, which is stored up as mass. The desire of mass to find the position appropriate to its changing potential is the cause of all motion of mass. All mass, seeking the true position for its changing potential, displaces other mass, which is also seeking the true position for its changing potential. All mass displaced must be replaced by its exact equal and opposite. The present theory that the moon would fall to the earth if it were not sustained by its motion is a mistaken one. The moon is not sustained in its position because of its motion, but because of its potential, which demands its own equilibrium pressure. The earth and the moon push each other away by their preponderance of expansion pressure with greater violence than they pull each other together by their contraction pressure. The moon is assisting in the replacement of displaced energy and is ever on its way toward inertia, following its spirally curving path through such eons of time that its successive orbits appear exactly equal in dimension. If the moon were detained in one position for a time, it would race to the place where normally it would have been had it not been detained. Just so with the planets. The Earth would not fall into the Sun if motion ceased, any more than a balloon would drop to the Earth or a cork sink in water. The hydrogen expelled from the Sun cannot drop back to the Sun. The expansion pressure of the Sun's radioactivity will not permit it. The expulsion of the planets by the Sun and the impossibility of their return is based on the same principle that makes the balloon and the cork remain where they are. The tendency of all mass to find the true pressure plane for its changing potential prevents it from falling to its origin of displacement. The motion of the planets is produced by the same force that produces all other motion in the universe. Gravitation accumulates mass and maintains its preponderance of pressure. Radiation distributes it. The universe of motion is one of continual change and continual adjustment of equilibrium. Diffusion and disappearance in inertia is the lot of planets as it is of men and of all evolving things, slowly changing their dimensions. They are all completing their centrifugal journeys south by way of west to their havens of rest, where they await their regeneration. Slowly expanding, they are drawing away from the Sun, assisted by the Sun in their recession. The Sun of the system is pushing them all slowly away to cool and drawing unto itself new light units for its regeneration, which will enable it to replace the ejected planets and to continue its own potency. The planets are the finished product of the Sun's fashioning, and the regenerative light units are the raw product from which the planets are fashioned. As the Sun is preponderantly pushing the planets, so are the planets doing likewise with their satellites, the grandchildren of the Sun. When the planets left the equatorial plane of the Sun, they were even then preponderantly radiative masses of such dimensions that their expulsion was imperative. As the sun's desire to push them farther and farther away exceeds its desire to attract them, their dimensions gradually adjust themselves to this desire. The nearer a mass is to its sun, the denser the mass, the higher its freezing point, the higher its equilibrium pressure, the smaller its volume, the faster its revolution, the slower its rotation, the more nearly parallel its plane of revolution to the solar ecliptic, the greater the positive charge, the greater the eccentricity, and the higher the potential, the greater is the ability of mass to attract the positive charge of other mass and to expel its negative discharge. The farther a mass is from its sun, the more tenuous the mass, the lower its freezing point, the lower its equilibrium pressure wall, the larger its volume, the slower its revolution, the faster its rotation, the greater the angle of its plane of revolution to the solar ecliptic, the less its eccentricity, the weaker the negative discharge, and the lower the potential, the less the ability to attract other mass, and to assist its own expulsion from other mass of higher potential. To expect this planet to fall to the sun, if its motion were checked, is equivalent to expecting an inflated balloon to drop to Earth. If these statements are demonstrable, then the Newtonian law cannot be true. For every change of dimension whatsoever in any mass alters the ability of that mass to conform to the requirements of that law, either by exceeding those requirements or by falling short of them. Every change of dimension in a mass changes all the dimensions in the mass. This universe of dimension is divided into pressure compartments of states of motion, which vary in orderly ratios. Between the compartments are inertial walls, which readjust their positions with every changing dimension of motion in the universe. A ball falling to the ground simultaneously displaces every atom in the universe and changes its dimensions. Something must simultaneously rise from this planet toward inertia to replace the falling ball. Mass expanded to greater volume must rise to the proper pressure zone for that increased volume. Low potential must rise to replace high potential, which has fallen. The farthest star must contract or expand to adjust its density to the changed potential thus caused. All of the planets and satellites of any system owe their positions of the moment to their dimensions and respective relations of the moment. They are all constantly falling toward the violet of disappearance, in positions appropriate to their expanding dimensions of decreasing potentials. In the same way, all of the generative light units, which are regenerating any system, are constantly falling toward the yellow of maximum incandescent appearance, in positions appropriate to their contracting dimensions of increasing potentials. Dimensions are as relative as the state of motion which they measure. All dimensions of mass simultaneously contract and expand with its changing potentials. The inertial planes which lie between any two masses or systems are relatively closer together in dense compact systems than in expanded systems of more widely separated parts. If opposing dense masses are forced into closer proximity, the four pressure zones which lie between the gravitational centers of the masses and their inertial planes are more restricted. The more restricted the pressure zones of a system, the more restricted the orbits of all planets and satellites within the four pressure zones of that system. Restricted orbits demand an orderly acceleration of all masses revolving within them. Accelerated mass revolving around the nucleus of a system increases the generative power of the vortex of that system, its maximum increase being at the perihelions of the planes of revolution of all the masses of the system. Accelerated revolution charges. Charging bodies attract. Accelerated rotation discharges. Discharging bodies repel. The ability of a mass to attract increases as the speed of revolution increases. The ability of a mass to repel increases as the speed of rotation decreases. Increase of generative power of a system means increase of the centripetal force of the system. Increase of the centripetal force of a system means increase of the potential of a system. Increase of potential means increase of positive charge. Increase of positive charge means increase of power to attract. The ability of one mass to attract another depends upon the relative positive charge of each and its relative position in respect to other masses. Increase of speed of revolution of the planets of a system means deceleration of rotation of the planets of that system. Deceleration of rotation of the planets of a system means decrease of the centrifugal force and consequent increase of the centripetal force of that system. The ability of one mass to repel another depends upon the relative negative discharge of each and its relative position in respect to other masses. Let us repeat the first law of gravitation. Every mass has the relative apparent ability to attract and to repel every other mass, its relative ability depending upon its relative potential. Increased centripetal force due to increased speed of revolution of masses revolving in restricted vortices, together with the lessened centrifugal force caused by retarding the rotation of the masses revolving in such vortices, necessarily raises the potential of a system. All dimensions of such systems change with the increased ability of the system to generate. Volume decreases. Orbital areas decrease. Decrease of volume is exactly balanced by acceleration of revolution. Equal areas must be covered in contracted orbits, as in expanded orbits of equal mass. In a contracted orbit, 30 trillion revolutions per second may be necessary to balance the area covered by an expanded orbit, making one revolution in 10 years. But an equilibrium of the universal constant must be maintained. Melting points are higher in contracted orbits. All standard units simultaneously change. Just so with all other dimensions. Their change would be purely relative and always in balance. The coefficients of all changes of dimensions of given masses would be in equilibrium at all times as equal totals of the universal constant. The attraction of gravitation in favoring the generation of energy is enabling electricity to accumulate as mass. All mass consists of energy accumulated by the attraction of gravitation into the appearance of form. All form is held together more or less closely by the relative force of gravitation, which accompanies mass of various dimensions and relations. The law for big mass is the same as that for little mass. The law of gravitation, which maps out the orbit of the light unit within the atom, is exactly the same as that which maps out the orbit of a planet of a solar system. In considering the effects of gravitation, it is difficult to project one's mind beyond the confines of this solar system. In fact, one's observations and experiences are so purely local that one's mind is rather closely bound to the effects of gravitation upon this planet alone. It is difficult to realize that this solar system is, on a large scale, but the repetitive effect of an atom of iron or manganese. It is difficult to realize that the planetary masses within the atom of iron have as relatively great a variation of ability to attract and to repel as have the planets of our solar system. It is also difficult to realize that our whole solar system is subject to the gravitational pull of the north overtone point of the wave of which it is but one atom. Science considers the attraction of gravitation of the solar system as an entirely different effect from the effect of motion within an atomic system. Atomic motion is presumed to be non-subject to the laws of gravitation. Science names one gravitation and the other an electrical effect. Both effects are the same. Also, both effects are born of the same conditions. Within an atom, The planets move in the planes of the orbits of their proper and changing pressures in a constant endeavor to find the proper pressures of their changing potentials, exactly as do the planets of a solar system. Until it is very near the nucleal sun, the charging light unit of a generative atom does not take a shortcut across lots through higher pressures to fall crashing into its sun, any more than do the charging light units of a solar system. It contracts gradually as it falls spirally toward the sun, and its potential, equilibrium pressure, and melting point constantly rise as it falls. Nor does the discharging light unit of a degenerative atom take a shortcut across lots through lowering pressures to break suddenly and explosively into a tenuous cloud at the inertial plane of disappearance, at the farthest bounds of its wave cycle. It leaves its nucleal sun with great force until it finds its proper potential. Then it expands gradually as it falls spirally away from its sun, its potential, equilibrium pressure, and melting point constantly lowering as it falls. If the movements of planets and satellites are effects of gravitation, and the same effects in smaller mass are electrical effects, why do smaller masses exactly follow the laws of the larger masses? The light units of an atom seem independent of the Earth's gravitative center, but actually they are not. All are revolving true to the planes of their respective potentials. The moons of Jupiter do exactly the same thing in respect to the solar gravitative center of this system, yet they are not considered an electrical effect. They fall toward the sun and away from it with the same apparent disregard that light units of a system evidence in respect to other masses outside their own systems. Even their accelerations and decelerations are affected by causes other than by whether they are moving toward the sun or away from it. A later volume will precisely chart the swirling drift of the so-called ether of space within and outside of the solar ecliptic area. This drift carries the planets of the solar system with it, as relentlessly as particles are carried in the swirling eddies of a rushing stream. All effects of gravitation are electric effects, and all effects of radiation are magnetic effects. All effects of motion are electromagnetic effects. All mass has a series of gravitative centers toward which it evidences its allegiance in the order of its potential relation. As a private in the army takes his orders from an under-officer, whose group in turn moves as a unit under the command of a higher officer, and so on until the entire army is coordinated under the command of one supreme officer, so does low potential obey the gravitational commands of low potential, and various states of accumulated potential obey the gravitational commands of accumulated potential, and so on until the entire mass is coordinated under one supreme gravitative center. Every wave of energy constructs resisting pressure walls between its south and north planes, and no mass can disregard those pressures. Within each wave of energy, all mass moves from low to high and back again to low potential, as a marble follows a groove, or as a train follows a track, or as a brook finds the sea. Let us consider each effect, that of falling and rising, as both gravitative and radiative, also electric and magnetic. An apple falling to the ground is an inductive electrical effect. It falls to the ground because gravitation attracts it to the ground. The positive charge of the apple seeks the greater positive charge of the earth. The falling apple charges the planet by induction, which raises the planet's potential. The greater proximity of the masses also raises the planet's potential. The induced positive charge of the apple continues centripetally in the generative flow toward the center of the planet. The resistance to the assimilation of the apple's positive charge by the planet registers itself in the exact amount of heat which left the apple. The absorption of the apple's heat Contraction pressure, potential, and electropositive charge is an electrical effect of discharge of the apple and an added charge to the planet. It is an exothermic effect in respect to the apple and an endothermic effect in respect to the planet. The absorption of the apple's electric potential by the planet is a gravitational effect because the apple and the planet mutually attract each other, and it is also an electric effect because of the absorption of the positive charge of one by the other. Both apple and planet fall toward each other. If the apple were as large and as dense as the planet, both would move toward each other with equal speed. The apple is so small and the planet so large that the deviation of the Earth's path is negligible. Not so with a body like the Moon, however, which materially affects the Earth's orbit as the two unequal partners whirl in their celestial dance, returning to the apple and the planet. As the positive charge of the apple continues its centripetal journey toward the center of the planet, the negative discharge of the apple expands toward disappearance in the opposite direction. One falls, the other rises. It is the positive charge which falls and the negative discharge which rises. The positive charge falls toward positive charge, expelling negative discharge as radioactive emanations. If positive charge falls toward positive charge, it is logical to say that the principle which governs positive charge alone has the ability to attract. The disintegrated apple rises from the ground because radiation repels it and positive charge expels it. The negative discharge of the apple seeks the greater expanse of low potential. Its rising is a radiative effect in respect to the planet, from which it is centrifugally rising to seek its own potential. As it rises, it expands until it finds its orbit in the pressure zone of its potential. It may impact against the inertial plane of another mass toward which it would centripetally fall and become regenerated. This would be a gravitative effect in respect to the mass toward which it fell. Its regeneration by impact against the inertial plane of another mass causes it to contract. It becomes electropositive. Its positive charge is attracted by the potential of the mass toward which it falls, and by which it is absorbed as nourishment, and finally discharged once more as radiative emanations. This is the manner of assembling and disassembling of every form of idea. This is the manner of accumulation and distribution of all energy. This is the manner in which all bodies are nourished and furnished. This is the process of vitalization and devitalization. All effects of motion are gravitational and radiational effects. Also, they are electric and magnetic effects, just as they are likewise chemical effects. Let us now consider the various gravitational and radiational expressions one by one. Fortunate it is that all of these expressions have dimensions, and that all dimensions are measurable. Let us first briefly consider them in their relation to the subject under discussion, which is the apparent power to attract or to repel. Let us then consider ways and means of measuring them, and see if, by so doing, some of nature's long-guarded secrets will not become simple to comprehend and to utilize. Chapter 13. Expressions of Gravitation and Radiation Universal Direction. The cycle of a wave is an orderly progression in the universal direction from south to north by way of east, and back again to south by way of west. All masses revolve from the west toward the east around the nucleal centers of their systems throughout the entire cycle of their waves. All masses rotate upon axes throughout the entire cycle of their waves from the west toward the east of their masses. To these laws, there are no exceptions. Numerous apparent exceptions, such as the retrogression of Neptune and her satellites, the moons of Uranus, and the outer moons of Jupiter and Saturn, are thoroughly in accord with the absolute laws of universal direction. All direction of motion is universal. Motion implies direction, demands direction in which to move. In the dimensionless universe of motion, direction is non-existent. In the universe of the illusion of dimension, direction is one of the necessary illusions which creates the appearance of dimension. Direction is, therefore, an illusion which we familiarly call an effect of motion. All effects of motion are expressed in apparent opposites. It is well to recall the fact that the concept of motion is universally simultaneous and its expression sequential. The attraction of gravitation and the repulsion of radiation are instantaneous and continuous. Time is not consumed in transferring the concept of any intended expression of energy throughout the dimensionless universe. The action which is an expression of the intent has dimension and therefore consumes time. In other words, the concept image of all ideas of thinking is universally simultaneous, but the production and reproduction of the form of ideas through motion is a series of events which are sequential. All opposite effects are positive and negative, or more and less, or plus and minus. Like all other effects of motion in the universe of dimension, direction has its opposites. In this universe of more and less, the opposites of that effect of motion, which we call direction, are north and south. All direction begins at the pressureless plane of south and ends at the opposed pressures plane of north. North is the electropositive plus direction of the more, and south is the electronegative minus direction of the less. The plus electric force is always away from the south toward north, and the minus magnetic force is always away from the north and back to the south. North begins at south at the point where energy expresses itself by impact against the inertial plane. At this point, energy simultaneously measures the intensity of its concept in harmonic circles on inertial planes over areas which become the bases of opposing cones of energy. It also measures the intensity of its concept at the intersection of the primary and secondary vertical inertial planes at altitudes which become the apices of those opposing cones. The axes of those cones then become the charging pole areas of all mass and the line of its forming wave. Energy simultaneously measures its volume intensity by connecting the circular inertial bases of conceptual cones with their apices. The harmonic circles, which measure the bases of cones, are the octave conceptual dimensions of the energy wave of measurable dimension. The apices of the cones are the overtones of the wave. The line of increasing force is from the magnetic base, following the northerly electric stream to the apex of every cone of energy. Conversely, the line of decreasing force is from the electric apex, following the southerly magnetic stream to the base of every cone of energy. South is the direction toward stability and the force of non-motion of substance in inertia. South is the plane of inertia where every expression of energy begins to gather its force from the expanded area of its harmonic circles, with the intent of overcoming the inertia of substance by concentrating it into harmonic spheres at its overtone points of north. All energy expresses itself in spiral waves. The inertial plane of every wave is its south. Every direction away from the inertial plane is north. South is the plane of inertia which apparently divides, as inertia is overcome, into two series of opposing planes of motion, the positive and the negative series. Each series of opposing planes of motion tilts spirally away from inertia on opposite sides until the harmonic circles which define their areas have not only attained angles of 90 degrees to it, but have turned halfway around. This process can best be visualized by placing two disks together and viewing them edgewise as lines. Then simultaneously tilt and rotate these disks away from each other on opposite edges until they are seen as two circular planes. South is the birthplace of motion, where inertia is overcome, and the wheels of the universal machine begin slowly to revolve. South is the birthplace of all effects of motion, where reality ends and illusion begins. South is the birthplace of idea, which becomes more defined in ever-increasing solidity as the form of idea contracts toward the north into harmonic spheres, which are diffused into tenuity as they expand toward disappearance on the south inertial plane of their birth. South is the birthplace of time, which accelerates all effects of motion in relative ratios as it contracts toward the north and decelerates them as it expands on its return to south. South is the aphelion point of all masses, moving in orbits around a point of north. South is the birthplace of all other dimensions of motion, which contract all their standard units of measurement as they concentrate in the electric stream flowing north, and expand those same standard units of measurement as they decentrate in the magnetic stream flowing south. North is the direction of instability and of the force of motion in opposition, where the opposites of every expression of energy meet in their maximum of expression. North is always the vortex of the whirlpool, at which every opposite expression of energy meets in bisexual union. North is the point where sex meets sex, where sexes meld as a bisexual one sex. North is the point of self-reproduction of the energy of its wave. North is the perihelion point of all masses, moving in orbits around a point of north. North is the point where generation ends, degeneration begins, and reproduction repeats. Generation is a journey to north from south, and degeneration is a return. Reproduction is a repetition of that journey to mass from plane. North is the meeting point of all of the positive-negative, plus-minus, male-female pressure walls, which have been erected toward both northerly overtone points of every wave, to help sustain the illusion of stability that this universe of motion constantly produces. Form in motion is a reflection of concept in inertia. Form is conceived in harmonic plane circles of non-motion and reflected in harmonic spheres of motion. North is the point of maximum instability, where the maximum gyroscopic motion of the universal machine lends its assistance in supporting the reflection of stability. The bisexual plane of the overtone of every wave is the flywheel of the universal machine, revolving with gyroscopic perfection of balance at an angle of 90 degrees to the inertial plane of concept of its wave of energy. In this reflected position, its resistance planes are parallel. There are no bevel gears, no precessional motions, and no intersecting planes. Gyroscopic imperfection of motion lies in precessional motion of wheels with bevel gears, and in intersecting planes of resisting pressures. No better example of gyroscopic imperfection of motion could be found than our own solar system, in which all of the planets revolve in planes of some variance to the solar equatorial plane, where resistance pressure walls intersect, and where precessional motion necessitates bevel gears for every wheel. The overtone plane of gyroscopic perfection is the plane where north meets south and east meets west in bisexual unity. The overtones of gyroscopic perfection are where the electric poles have contracted to a point, and where the ever-shortening positive cones of energy turn their outer positive contours into inner negative ones by expanding their bases to the planes of their apices. The planes of gyroscopic imperfection are the opposing planes of pressure walls, ever moving tonally in locked potential positions toward the ultimate north of their waves of energy. These planes of gyroscopic imperfection are the tonal positions of the elements of matter in which various states of energy are locked within ever-contracting pressure compartments of the cones of their waves. The opposing planes are the positive, negative, equal, and opposite actions and reactions, which constitute the more and the less of positive and negative action and reaction. At these planes, reproduction of motion is only possible through union. These planes are the planes of sex, male and female, which constitute the division of all effects of motion into the opposites of motion. North is the direction of the action of effort, as south is the direction of its reaction. North is the point toward which electricity apparently attempts to gather the universal substance together into one solid inert mass. But failing in this, it gathers an illusion of the substance into innumerable separate harmonic spheres through the motion of the thinking process. All direction is an effect of gravitation and radiation. All gravitative effects are electrically dominated. All gravitative effects are the result of inhalation. All radiative effects are magnetically dominated. All radiative effects are the result of exhalation. Electricity always moves in the direction of north, by the way of east. Magnetism always moves south, by the way of west. Nature divides these pressure compartments into octaves, 4 of which are contracting pressures under electric control, and the other 4 are expanding pressures under magnetic control. Between the 3rd and the 4th pressure walls in the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th octaves, the opposing pressures become so great that nature creates mid-tonal pressure compartments where storm centers are much more concentrated and the velocity of revolution is multiplied. Nature accumulates the intensity of energy expression in every wave from the southerly inertial line of the inert gases to the northerly carbon line of maximum motion. The cones of energy, within which all expressions of motion are contained, are ever changing their positions, so that their apices are continually moving spirally away from points of concept and returning to those same points. The accompanying charts of the mechanics of motion will more clearly demonstrate nature's process of energy accumulation and distribution. The spiral direction of all motion is the cause of the 2 other opposites of direction known as east and west. East is a contraction of the inertial south of concept and memory of form toward the north of reflection of concept through motion, and west is north's expansive return toward south. Motion cannot express itself in the direction of a straight line. Newton's first law of physics, which states that a moving body left to itself moves forever in a straight line with a uniform velocity, is not in conformity with the laws of motion. In this universe of varying pressures, all masses floating in space constantly move in the direction of their changing potentials. This direction is always spiral, all motion being spiral, all direction being curved, and all pressure planes being conic sections. Electric action cannot proceed directly north from south in a straight line, but must progress toward north in a spiral direction. As electropositive action proceeds northerly, it contracts. The direction of contraction is north by the way of east. East is toward least rotation at the gravitative center of any mass. The maximum of east is where east meets north following the charging areas of mass. As electronegative action returns toward south, it expands. The direction of expansion is south by the way of west. West is toward the greatest rotation at the surface of any mass. The maximum of west is where west meets south, following the ecliptic plane of any mass. The minimum exertion of the easterly force of contraction must therefore be in the plane of the equator of any mass, and its force directed toward the gravitative center of that mass. In every mass, the maximum exertion of the easterly force of contraction is within the charging areas of the generative cones, of which the pole of rotation is the axis. In every mass, the maximum exertion of the westerly force of expansion is within the discharging areas of the radiative cones, of which the equator is the base. In every mass, north meets east at the pole of rotation, the axis of the generative cones of energy, of which the northeasterly electric stream and the southwesterly magnetic lines of force are the opposing contours. It may be well to recall the law of generation. All mass is generated and regenerated by a contractive pressure exerted in the direction of its gravitative center. Its minimum of generative pressure is exerted from its equatorial plane, and its maximum pressure from its pole. South meets west at the axis of the radiative cones of energy, of which the expansion of the equatorial plane of revolution into the isoclinal planes of magnetic force are the contours. Thus may we repeat the law of radiation of mass. All mass is radiated and diffused by an expansive pressure exerted in the direction of its surface. Its minimum of radiative pressure is exerted from its pole, and its maximum from its equatorial plane. East contracts toward north, and west expands toward south. Contraction is centripetal, and expansion is centrifugal. The increase of centripetal force of any mass is in the direction of generation, and the increase of centrifugal force is in the direction of radiation. Centripetal force accumulates, and centrifugal force dissipates. Mass is accumulated in the direction of its generation, and dissipated in the direction of its radiation. Centripetal force decelerates rotation and accelerates revolution. Centrifugal force accelerates rotation and decelerates revolution. The deceleration of rotation is in the direction of generation, and the deceleration of revolution is in the direction of radiation. All vortices turn from west to east, and their apices point to north. If the above laws are well founded, the directions of east and north must be related to the attraction of gravitation. Also, the directions of west and south must be related to the repulsion of radiation. Also, if deceleration of rotation increases in the centripetal, easterly direction of contraction, decelerated rotation must, in some manner, be related to the attraction of gravitation. Conversely, if acceleration of rotation increases in the centrifugal, westerly direction of expansion, accelerated rotation must, in some manner, be related to the repulsion of radiation. Also, if acceleration of revolution increases in the centripetal, easterly direction of contraction, accelerated revolution must, in some manner, be related to the attraction of gravitation. Conversely, if revolution decreases in the centrifugal, westerly direction of expansion, decelerated revolution must, in some manner, be related to the repulsion of radiation. Chapter 14. Universal Mathematics, Universal Ratios. Universal mathematics are basically simple dimensions in ratios of equal and opposite tonal actions and reactions of opposite expressions of the one force. All expression of force is either plus or minus equilibrium of motion and inertia. Universal mathematics are based on the plus and minus relationships of tonal pressures due to the opposition of sex, force, and motion. Opposition means plus and minus. There can be no expression of force without the evidence of that expression in pressures. All dimensions are tonal. All expression of force is tonal. All pressures are tonal. All effects of motion are tonal. All tones are definite relations. All definite relations are in accord with the simple formula of the locked potentials. All direction is either toward the electric force of higher potential, which is increasingly resisted, or toward the magnetic force of lower potential, which is increasingly assisted in the universal ratio. All directions are pressure directions. This universe of motion is a universe of varying pressures which cause that motion. All pressures are either the contraction pressures of charging mass or the expansion pressures of discharging mass. Let us add to the pressure laws a dimension law. All dimensions contract in the direction of electric force and expand in the direction of magnetic force in universal ratio. Equilibrium of motion in inertia is represented by 0. 0 in sex, force, and motion means an equilibrium of pressures. 4 means maximum pressure opposition. The intermediate 2s and 3s, plus and minus, are the comings and goings between the cold 0 of expansion in the violet of inertia and the hot 4 of contraction in the yellow of opposed motion. 0 in force does not represent nothingness, nor does plus mean more than nothing, nor minus mean less than nothing. Such a concept of mathematics is not in accord with the universe of the illusion of motion. The one substance is a tangible substance. It is something. This is not an empty universe. It is not a void. Non-dimension does not mean nothingness. The universe of the one thinking substance is not one of quantity or dimension. It is a substance capable of causing an appearance of quantity through the life principle of the substance, which we term energy. The universal constant of energy is x quantity. X quantity is apparently divisible. This divisibility of quantity and its dimensions are relative and measurable. The relations of its dimensions are in fixed ratios. These ratios are simple and absolute, but their apparent variability is complex. The universal constant may be added to or multiplied by, but its accumulation never varies in its relative dimensions. The dimension x is unimportant, for it represents the illusion of a total of apparent motion which disappears in the equilibrium of inertia. The dimensions of relative ratios are important, for by knowledge of these relations, one will be enabled to assemble divided quantities in any desired multiple to produce any desired effect. All dimensions are relative. All dimensions are either more or less than equilibrium. This is a universe of more and less. Every effort of motion which is added to must be equally subtracted from. Mathematics are bounded by the absolute limits of effects of motion measured by adding to or by subtracting from in universal ratio. Mathematics cannot transcend universal limitations. Multiplication and division are but ratios of more and less. This universe of dimension is limited in its expression to more and less. All units are either plus or minus. Therefore, all systems other than the double tone unit systems 504T and 100 equal sign are either plus or minus in their pressure totals. Every plus pressure total must be balanced by a -1 to maintain a system in equilibrium. No mathematical conclusion, the product of which does not yield an equilibrium, can be a correct conclusion. The product of every mathematical conclusion must balance as an equilibrium in order for it to be a correct conclusion. If correct conclusions regarding effects of motion are mathematically demonstrable, they are also mechanically demonstrable. Also, they are chemically and electrically demonstrable. Also, they are measurable as dimensions in their potential relations of plus x or minus x. The universal seesaw is ever tilting above and below its balancing point in inertia. Both movements are simultaneous and exactly balanced. The wave is the universal seesaw within which all dimensions are measured. Many times in these pages, it has been stated that a change in any one dimension causes a simultaneous change in all of the other dimensions. A sphere which is doubled in its radius is squared in its plane area in section and cubed in its volume. A mass, which has expanded to the cube of its former volume, freely floating in space, could not have so expanded without changing its potential position to one appropriate to double its former distance from its gravitative center, but in its same plane. In such a position, the constant of opposing pressures is 1/8 that of the original position, for the same constant of pressure has been spread over 8 times the volume. In such a position, the constant of temperature has also been expanded to cover 8 times the volume. All temperature dimensions of expanding mass increase in their expansion dimension, registering greater cold, and decrease in their contraction dimension, registering greater heat. It must not be forgotten that all effects of motion are expressed in their plus and minus opposites. All plus effects of motion have been clearly defined as generative, contractive effects, and all minus effects have been defined as radiative, expansive effects. It must not be forgotten that all mass is either preponderantly charging or adding to, or it is preponderantly discharging or subtracting from. For this reason, all effects of motion in mass must be measured in both of their opposite dimensions, their plus and their minus dimensions. The plus dimension shall herein be called the contraction dimension. The contraction dimension is the charging dimension of the electropositive force, which winds the cosmic clock. The minus dimension shall herein be called the expansion dimension. The expansion dimension is the discharging dimension of the electronegative force, which unwinds the cosmic clock. Chapter 15. Expressions of gravitation and radiation. The electric charging poles and magnetic discharging bases. Every particle of matter in this universe is connected with every other particle of matter by electric charging poles, which are the controls of opposing electromagnetic cones of energy. The apices of these opposing cones meet at the gravitative centers of every particle of matter. The bases of these opposing cones meet at the inertial planes which lie between any two masses. The gravitative center of every particle of matter is the telegraphic center of communication, and the electric poles are the channels of communication. By means of this connection, every particle of matter in the universe is gravitating and radiating information about any change of dimension in any other mass. All mass simultaneously responds to these communications by a sympathetic contractive or expansive readjustment of its own dimensions. The electric poles are vortices that control the northerly flowing electric stream and determine the southerly flowing magnetic stream. All energy expresses itself in motion. All motion is expressed in waves. All waves are sequentially evolved by electric actions into accumulations of mass around minute whirlpool storm centers. All whirlpool storm centers are formed by resistant magnetic reactions. All waves, all effects of motion, and all dimensions of motion within the wave are measured by the opposition of the electric poles and magnetic bases. Opposition between electric and magnetic flows begins on the south inertial planes. The two flows pass each other at 180 degrees, and the opposition reaches its maximum at an angle of 90 degrees to the inertial planes. During this progression, the 180 degrees of opposition is rigidly maintained. The electric pole measures the northern opposed distance limitations of the wave at trough and crest in points of wave altitudes, which we shall call the overtones. The magnetic base measures the southern opposed area limitations of the wave, which we shall call the harmonic circles. Thus are distance and area, the first two dimensions of motion, born of inertia. By connecting the overtones with every point of the harmonic circles, opposing cones are produced. Thus is volume, the third dimension of motion, born of inertia. Energy is simultaneously conceived in inertia and sequentially expressed in motion away from inertia. All dimensions of energy, both gravitational and radiational, are simultaneously marked off in inertia and sequentially transferred in expression to the wave, which records sequences of motion. Thus is time, the fourth dimension of motion, born of inertia, by the expression of concept in opposing cones of generation and radiation. Sex, the fifth dimension, is born of inertia, within the opposing cones, by reproduction through sex union, exerted in sequence, and in opposing pressures and potentials. The sixth and seventh dimensions are born of inertia, by resistance to the opposing electromagnetic flow. Temperature, the eighth dimension, is born of inertia, and so are all the dimensions born of inertia, by overcoming it and expressing their opposition in alternating oscillations, and so also are all of the opposites of each dimension born of their relative positions in the opposing cones of energy. The nearer to the axis and to the apex of the cone, the greater the density, temperature, pressure, potential, power time, and all effects of electropositive preponderance. This is the direction of areas of increasingly high contraction pressure. The nearer the base of the cone, the greater the tenuity, the speed time, and the tendency to ionize, and the lower the temperature, pressure, potential, and all effects of electronegative preponderance. This is the direction of areas of increasingly low expansion pressure. The equator of all mass is, therefore, the dividing plane between the opposing plus and minus pressures of the electromagnetic forces. It is the plane where expansion pressure is preponderant in the maximum expansion of the mass. It is the plane of least density. The pole has maximum density and rigidity. All electropositive actions are produced in all mass by contraction of the generative cones of energy toward the high contraction pressures of their poles of rotation. All electronegative reactions are produced in all mass by expansion of the radiative cones of energy toward the high expansion pressures of their equators. This action and reaction of contraction and expansion supply the electromagnetic motor force for the construction of the little corpuscular pumps of which all mass is composed, and by which its mechanics are coordinated. In the process of accumulation of little mass into big mass, the little pumps meld into one big pump, each working as a unit, but all working for the whole. This is as true in the accumulation of mass into the form of man as into a planet. Big mass is but a multiplication of the power of little mass. The desire of electricity is to accumulate mass toward the north. The desire of magnetism is to dissipate mass toward the south. Electricity attempts to express its desire for action by opposing inertia and ends in non-motion of its speed-time dimension at the ultimate gravitative centers of all masses and systems. This effect is counterbalanced, however, by its opposite effect of increased speed of revolution in the power-time dimension. Magnetism attempts to express its desire to suppress motion through opposing it, and ends in expressing great motion at the equators and ecliptic areas of all masses and systems. This effect is, in turn, also counterbalanced by its opposite effect of increased speed of revolution in the power-time dimension. Electricity strives to simulate inertia by gyroscopic perfection of motion. The more stable the gyroscopic revolution, the more elusively unstable its precessional progressions. Magnetism, in seeking to suppress motion, actually assists it by drawing the harmonic circles of its area dimension gradually into the plane of the electric north, thus creating a new south plane of zero latitude around the point of north at the overtone position of each wave. This plane is reflected at the equator of each mass of each wave. This new reflected image of the south inertial plane in mass or system will be called the ecliptic plane of mass or system. The ecliptic plane of mass or system revolves with revolving mass or system. The ecliptics of all elements between the inertial harmonic circles and the overtones vary in their expansion and contraction according to their position and the relative expansion and contraction of the opposing cones of energy. At the overtones, the ecliptic is a plane born of the melding of both contours and bases in the plane of the melded apices of the opposing cones. From the overtones toward inertia, the ecliptics of all waves, systems, and masses expand as the bases of the generative cones expand. The apparent relative ability of mass to attract and repel is governed by the contraction of its polar magnetic bases and the expansion of its ecliptic. The greater the expansion of the ecliptic, and the greater the diameters of precessional orbits, the less the ability of a mass to attract and repel. The less the expansion of the ecliptic, and the smaller the diameters of the precessional orbits, the greater the ability of a mass to attract and repel. In any mass, the diameters of its polar magnetic bases and of its axial precessional orbits increase as the mass recedes from, and decrease as it approaches, its nucleal sun's equatorial plane. In any mass, the expansion of its ecliptic, the diameters of its equatorial precessional orbits, and of its polar magnetic bases increase as the mass recedes from, and decrease as it approaches, its nucleal sun's equatorial plane. If these laws are well founded, the expansion of the ecliptic, the diameters of polar magnetic bases, and the dimensions of precessional orbits must be related to the attraction of gravitation and the repulsion of radiation. Let us consider some familiar effects of the above principles in relation to this planet and solar system. Consider the great expansion of the ecliptic plane areas of the outer planets of low potential as compared to those of the inner ones of high potential. Consider the tenuity of the outer planets where the precessional orbits are extended as compared to the density of the inner ones where the precessional orbits are restricted. Consider the preponderance of centrifugal force, which counteracts the gravitative power of the very decomposed outer planets, as compared to the preponderance of centripetal force, which assists the inner planets in holding themselves together. Consider the outer planets' charging poles, which are far removed from their poles of rotation, as compared to the inner planets' charging poles, which are closer to their axial poles, the nearer the planet is to the sun. The charging poles are wrongly termed magnetic poles. Consider the slight attraction and repulsion power of the outer planets, which float in extremely low pressure zones, as compared to the great attraction and repulsion power of the inner ones which float in high pressure zones. To remain as close to the sun as Mercury requires a potential approaching that of the sun itself. Consider the low melting and freezing points of the outer planets, where our gases are their solids, as compared to the high melting points of the inner planets. To remain frozen as close to the sun as Mercury requires a pressure equilibrium approaching that of the sun itself. Let us now consider the charging poles in respect to their apparent relative ability to attract. It is commonly supposed that the north pole of a magnet is the positive pole, which attracts, and the south pole of a magnet is its negative pole, which repels. The apparent ability of the positive pole of a magnet to attract the negative, and the negative to attract the positive, has been one of the evidences that has built up the theory that opposite charges attract, and like charges repel. Further deceptive evidence in support of this theory lies in the fact that the north positive pole of a magnetized bar of iron will appear to repel the north positive pole of a compass needle, and, on the contrary, the south negative pole of a magnetized bar of iron will appear to attract the north positive pole of a compass needle. The evidence that like charges repel is as convincing as the belief that the moon keeps pace with a moving man, or that the earth is flat. It is evidence that one can really see, like other illusions of motion. The truth is that north is the apex of a cone into which a supernormal electric stream is spirally flowing due to electric excitation. The reason that the south pole of the bar of iron appears to attract the north pole of the compass needle is that the electric stream is flowing through both the iron and the needle in the same direction, from south to north. To expect them to do otherwise would be equivalent to expecting two water pipes, through which streams are flowing, to continue their flow as one stream if the water pipes were joined together in such a way that the streams were flowing in opposite directions. Just as the two separate streams of water would apparently repel each other if the pipes were so joined, so would they appear to attract each other and flow as one stream if the pipes were joined, so that their streams were flowing in the same direction. One may demonstrate the truth of this by cutting a magnetized bar of iron anywhere between its opposite poles. It will then be seen that a new north and south pole will appear on each of the two separate bars. This process may be repeated indefinitely, always with the same result. The so-called magnetized bar of iron is one in which a strong electric inductive current has so greatly contracted the generative and expanded the radiative cones of energy of the atoms of iron that their polar magnetic bases and their ecliptic expansions have been vastly reduced, and the speeds of their generative and radiative flows correspondingly increased. Atoms of iron not so treated leap toward these faster flowing streams. The term magnetized was given to iron so treated because iron exposed to the magnetic field of a generative coil always causes this effect. The magnetic field of a generative coil is the radioactive emanation or discharge of an overcharged coil. It is the degeneration of a generating charge when it leaves the generative coil. In other words, it is the leakage or overflow from an overfilled receptacle. Not so, however, when it impacts against the iron. It then becomes regenerated. The negative discharge becomes a positive charge. The iron bar becomes electrified, not magnetized. The bar of iron and the so-called magnetic poles of a revolving rotating mass, such as this planet, are two different effects. Every mass, such as this planet, is supposed to be a magnet. It is, but not like the magnetized bar of iron or the compass needle. It is a double magnet. Its two charging poles meet head-on at the gravitative center of the planet, and the oppositely flowing electric streams meet there exactly as oppositely flowing streams of water would meet if water pipes were opposed as described above. In any mass, when these two streams meet, they oppose and spread against each other's force in the direction of the ecliptic plane area of the mass. It is commonly supposed that the magnetic pole of this planet is analogous to a bar magnet, being one continuous bar extending from the negative Antarctic south to the positive Arctic north. A compass needle nearing the south magnetic pole dips so violently that it seems desirous of plunging arrowhead first directly into the sea. This apparently supports the theory that opposite poles attract, for here the north attractive positive pole of the compass is attracted to its south supposedly repellent negative pole. Carry this experiment further and approach the north magnetic pole with the compass. Upon nearing it, the same effect is produced as that at the south pole. The magnetic needle seems to desire to dive vertically into the sea. This appears to be the opposite effect from that cited in the magnet bar and compass experiment. The north attractive positive pole of the planet appears to attract the north attractive positive pole of the compass, and the south repellent negative pole of the planet appears to attract the north attractive positive pole of the compass. The explanation lies in the fact that the one north direction of attraction in the bar of iron and compass is continuous, while the two north directions of attraction in the planet are opposed. They meet at the center of the Earth at the apices of two opposing cones. The magnetic bases of these two cones are respectively in the Arctic and Antarctic regions. As mass generates, the magnetic bases disappear. The diameters of the bases extend from the known major charging poles through the poles of rotation to the unknown minor charging poles situated at equal distances on the opposite sides of the poles of rotation. It has previously been explained that the north of any mass is its gravitative center. The direction of north is along the electric axis of the contracting cones of generation from their bases to their apices. North is always in the direction of genero activity, high pressure, and high potential. In any mass, north is the gravitative radiative center, where the apparent ability to attract and to repel is at its maximum. On the contrary, south is always in the direction of radioactivity, low pressure, and low potential. South is an extension of the equatorial plane, which divides any mass. It is that part of the mass where radiative emanations are at their maximum. It is the plane of disappearance of the contours of the expanding cones of radiation. It must continually be borne in mind that electricity contracts and attracts from within, and that magnetism expands and repels also from within. Consider the isoclinal lines which girdle this planet approximately parallel to its equator, according to very careful surveys for terrestrial magnetic charts, at every 10 degrees of latitude between the equator and the poles. If that portion of the planet between any of these isoclinal lines and either of the poles were lifted out, one would be looking into one of the gripping cone clutches of the universal machine, or one of the slipping disc clutches, the apex of which reaches somewhere near the equatorial plane of the planet. The contour of the cone, thus exposed, would give the direction of the magnetic lines of force which emanate from the planet and seek their regeneration at the pole of the hemisphere from which they emanate. This same effect of magnetic lines of force may be produced by the well-known experiment of causing iron filings to find magnetic lines of force by placing them on a piece of paper which is vibrated rapidly over a magnetic bar of iron. Some filings will always follow the direction of the outward flowing magnetic stream, and some will find the direction of the inward flowing electro-regenerative stream. The current within a bar of iron flowing from south to north is an electric flow, and the current is an induced current. The discharged current, which flows outside the bar of iron, is a magnetic flow, which is conducted by the more expanded surrounding medium to a lower potential, or is deflected and regenerated by the resistance of the surrounding connecting medium. When so deflected, it is again attracted to the south pole of the bar of iron, where it re-enters as an electric flow. Science describes this effect as magnetic induction. Magnetic induction is impossible. Induction is evidence of regeneration through sufficient resistance to degenerative conduction. Induction is an effect of generation or regeneration. Induction is centripetal. Its flow is northerly. Conduction is an effect of degeneration. Conduction is centrifugal. Its direction is southerly. If this is true, then induction must be related to the attraction of gravitation and conduction to the repulsion of radiation. If it is true, that these are so related, it must necessarily follow that a strong inductive effect is always simultaneously accompanied by a strong conductive effect. If this latter is true, it must necessarily follow that increasing induction, which means increasing positive charge, must be accompanied by an increasing power to attract. It must also be accompanied by an increasing negative discharge and an increasing power to repel. It is easy to test these statements by applying them to any known inductive and conductive effects. Consider the storage battery, for example. Increase its charge, and its discharge also increases. Electric bulbs connected with its conductive outlet will brighten. Consider the sun. Its ability to radiate and to repel is great because of its great ability to generate and to attract. Consider each planet in the order of its potential position in its system. The ability of each to discharge and to repel lessens with the lowering of its potential position in its system. Just so with all mass. As its potential is lowered, which means that its polar magnetic bases are enlarged, and its ecliptic expansion is increased, its ability to generate, charge, attract, radiate, discharge, and repel is also increased. When a bar of iron is magnetized, it is in reality electrified. The magnetic bases of the iron atoms have been contracted. Let us now imagine the charging poles of this planet as two immense bar magnets turned positive end to positive end and placed so that they meet at its gravitative radiative, attractive repellent, charging discharging, genero-radiative center. Let us examine the potential position of the Earth and what relation the positions of its so-called magnetic poles and the expansion of the Cancer-Capricorn belt have to its ability to charge, attract, discharge, and repel. Let us see why its orbit is inclined over 7 degrees to the solar equator, and why the space allotted to it is defined as a distance of 92,900,000 miles, beyond which it cannot go without increasing its polar bases and ecliptic expansions, and within which it cannot trespass without decreasing them. Up above Hudson Bay, on this planet, is a shifting point known as the North Magnetic Pole. This is the planet's point of maximum electric charge. This, and a corresponding shifting point near the South Pole, are the 2 points of maximum generation. At these 2 points of our planet, the universal force connects its charging wires to this storage battery we call the Earth. These points shall therefore be termed the charging poles. The charging poles are practically 20 degrees away from the pole of rotation. A circle drawn through them would define the polar magnetic base of this planet. North of the equator, 23°27'08, is a line indicating the northerly limit of the intersection of this planet's ecliptic plane with itself. South of the equator, at the same distance, is the southerly limit of intersection. If the planet were a perfectly true sphere, the charging poles and the axis of rotation would coincide. There would be no magnetic base. There would also be no Cancer-Capricorn belt, for the plane of the ecliptic and of the equator would coincide. Furthermore, the plane of the Earth's ecliptic and its equator would coincide with the plane of the solar equator. This planet's ecliptic is inclined over 7 degrees to the plane of the solar equator, and its equator is inclined 23°27'08 to the plane of its ecliptic. This results in a very low potential compared to Mercury or Venus, and a high one in respect to the outer planets. It also results in a low freezing point and rigidity that would be impossible in a position 10 million miles nearer to the Sun, or in a plane 2 degrees closer to that of the solar equator. The potential position of this planet necessitates a small percentage of oblateness, or flattening of the poles. Stay tuned for the final part of the Universal One. Peace, blessings, and much love to you all.